Hello everyone, my name is Michael and welcome to Orthodox Classicist. Today we'll go through the first chapter of Porphyry's Isagoge and begin our study on the primary works of classical reasoning. To preface, Porphyry was a Neoplatonist philosopher born in Tyre roughly around 234 AD. He studied under Pontius, another well-known Platonist, and wrote various books on Platonism, the life of Pontius, and including writings on Aristotle's logical works. Porphyry was the first Platonist to write commentaries on Aristotle's logical works, and his work, the Isagoge, or Introduction, has been influential in the understanding of Aristotle's works, and overall beginning the study of classical reasoning. People quit the study of classical reasoning because of Porphyry, but with patience you'll find it to be easier of a study compared to other works. And in reading Porphyry, from my experience, studying Aristotle becomes easier, so it is worth the time and effort put in. There is a reason why, as Aristotle's works were put together in a single codex, that you'll find Porphyry's introduction included at the beginning of the Organon. In conclusion, the introduction is a standard introductory text in Rome and Byzantium, both as it was read in Greek and translated into Latin with Aristotle's texts. With that said, I'll give you an outline. Firstly, Porphyry gives us his reasoning for writing this. It is for us to know the five predicables and their important role in forming definitions. He tells us this in paragraph 1. Next, Porphyry tells us his manner of writing, simply a brief summary. He tells us this in paragraph 2. Then Porphyry limits himself on what he'll discuss. He tells us this in paragraph 3. Lastly, Porphyry's positive plan in doing all of this will be sourced in the followers of Aristotle, the Peripatetics. With all that said, we will now begin reading Porphyry. Let's start with paragraph 1. Porphyry says, "Since it is necessary, both to the doctrine of the categories of Aristotle, and to the formation of definitions, and in short, to those things which pertain to division and demonstration, to know what genus and difference, species and peculiarity, and accident are, since also the theory of these is useful." The five terms Porphyry lists are called the predicables, not to confuse this with predicates. Predicables are things which are predicated, and predicates are what we say about a subject. Aristotle's works, the categories, explains how we organize the different ways that we speak about things, aka predicate about things. Categories in Greek is just another way to say predicates. The first predicables are as follows: genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. These five, Porphyry tells us, will help us understand the teachings found in Aristotle. The first one is genera, which is the plural for genus, and it refers to a class of things. Species refers to the classes contained within a genus. Difference refers to the characteristic which is the cause of that division. Peculiarity refers to a characteristic of a thing that's unique to that thing. For example, humans laugh and horses neigh. Accidents, later known as contingent attributes, refers to qualities that may or may not be present in the thing. For example, an individual being tall. I'll illustrate each. Genus and species works like animal and man. Man is a species that is contained in the genus animal. With this, we can make the definition of man. Man is an animal. Yet, although man is a species within an animal, it is not the only species contained within it, but other species are contained within animal too, such as horses and birds. The specific difference between man and other species that isn't man is that man is rational. With this, we can now say man is a rational animal. Thus, this difference explains the kind of animal man is. I said for peculiarity that humans laugh, and with the definition, laughing is unique to man only. If we point to something and say it is a man, then it can laugh. If something laughs, then it is a man. Laughing is a peculiar quality found only in man. Another way to speak of laughing is risibility. Accidents, on the other hand, can be case by case among the individual men. If we point to a 6'3" man, we can say that that man is tall. Yet, just because that man is tall doesn't mean that anything that is tall is a man. Man is not special in being tall, nor can be divided into being tall or not. Likewise, being short or not, since other animals can be said as short. This cannot be used to divide man from other animals. And note, peculiarity is not the reason why things are divided, but it is unique to that species only. With all of this said, we can say that man is a rational animal, peculiarly capable of being risible or laughing. Man can be tall or short, or white or black, or yellow or brown. These are the 5 predicables. But Porphyry also tells us that these 5 predicables allow us to formulate definitions. To properly define something requires knowledge of the 5 predicables. And with these 5 words, they shape all knowledge we possess and will interact with later. Why is this important, you may ask? A lot of the problems in philosophical discussions, at some level, reside in the use of words and concepts themselves, and whether we are using them consistently or changing them occasionally. We often use words colloquially, and when we try to discuss or debate important topics in areas of philosophy, such as ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, or other disciplines like natural science, politics, history, and so on, we often use the same words and use them in reference to different ideas, but aren't conscious of them nor cautious when we use them. One kind of fallacy is literally called the word concept fallacy, which refers to the act of using a single word and yet failing to discern if the concept of that word is the same in various circumstances it is used. And due to the complexity of some of these problems, philosophers and theologians are usually the ones responsible for connecting terms and concepts together, while giving us a model of how we should use them, by seeing how they use them in their works. In short, definitions are difficult to formulate, and should be done by philosophers because of this. And yet, when Porphyry speaks about the 5 predicables, he says, and to the formation of definitions, and in short, to those things which pertain to division and demonstration. Fortunately, people who take up the study of classical reasoning and discipline themselves to be a student under the various masters thereof, he or she will be able to understand, maybe even formulate, definitions themselves, as well as other things, Porphyry says, that being division and demonstration, and later on even describing things. Let's move on. In a summary way, I will briefly endeavor to discuss for you, in the form, as it were, of an introduction, what has been delivered on this subject by the ancients, abstaining from more profound investigations, but appropriately directing my attention to such as are more simple. Porphyry wrote the Isagoge as an introduction. He will explain these predicables, giving us a practical and academic use of Aristotle's ideas by investigating the Peripatetics. To explain in short, the Peripatetics are developers and followers of Aristotle's teachings. When Aristotle used to teach, he would walk around. The Greek word used to refer to him walking around, peripatein, carried over to his followers, the ones who walk around while teaching. Porphyry will explain to us the meaning and use of the predicables sourced from these men, the ancients he calls them, while, quote, abstaining from more profound investigations, but appropriately directing my attention to such as are more simple. With this said, Porphyry limits himself from going beyond this goal, keeping his inquiries simple and the explanations solely on the predicables themselves. So what are those inquiries he limits himself from going over? He says, my meaning is that I shall omit to speak about genera and species, whether they have a subsistence in the nature of things, or have an existence alone in the mere conceptions of the soul. And if they have a subsistence in the nature of things, whether they have bodies or incorporeal, and whether they are separate from sensibles or insensibles, and about these have their subsistence. For a discussion of this kind is most profound and requires another and a greater investigation. They all require discussions on metaphysics. When we speak of things such as humanity, animal, and redness, do these universals have some kind of reality in the world itself, or do they exist only as concepts in the mind? This is the classic problem of universals. This will be observed in the Middle Ages and will eventually result in 2 well-known traditions answering this question: nominalism and Platonic realism. We won't be talking about this problem until later. We won't be speaking about this problem in this series. Neither will Porphyry. I'll explain the 3 questions, and I'll start with the first one. The first of the 3 questions are as follows: whether genera or species have a subsistence in the nature of things, or have an existence along in the mere conceptions of the soul. Subsistence is another way to say existing, and is the way Thomas Taylor translated the Greek word, meaning that which exists or subsists. To put it another way, do these predicables exist in our minds alone, or have being in reality? When we point to 3 people, Saints Basil, Gregory, and John Chrysostom, and we say all 3 of them are human beings, Are we saying there is something common to them that corresponds to the humanness of them all? Or is human a concept that we make by connecting similarities between things? The second question is, does the predicables have a subsistence or existence in the nature of things, whether they are bodies or incorporeal? This is a question on how does the predicables exist? Are they inside physical things? Like I can pull out humanity out of St. Basil and point to it? Obviously not. But if these predicables exist, what, key phrase here, mode of being is possessed by universals? Lastly, whether they are separate from sensibles, which is what Plato taught, or insensibles, which is what Aristotle teaches, and about these have their subsistence. Sensibles refer to what we can see. So in another way, can the predicables be separated from things which can be known by our five senses? This is a Platonic way of thinking. For example, humanity itself as species to a genus animal can exist independently of individual human beings. Each peculiar individual simply participates in being human. If not, the alternative question is, do the predicables exist in things which can be known by our five senses? For example, humanity isn't outside the individual humans, but instead, each individual that is human. Saints Basil, Gregory, and John all possess human nature. This is Aristotle's view. These questions matter, for predicables describe how universal concepts are predicated of individual things. Saint Basil is a man. Man is an animal. Man is rational. It's simply until you switch your question from what man is to what man is itself. Porphyry tells us that he won't discuss these things, but merely touch the logical use of the predicables. Lastly, paragraph 4 says, in what manner, however, the ancients, and especially the Peripatetics, discuss these, and the other proposed objects of inquiry, in a more logical manner, I will now endeavor to show you. As Porphyry concludes, he tells us that this study will be done in a more logical manner, rather than a metaphysical one. This will be the last time you will hear about the Peripatetics from Porphyry, but keep in mind that the things Porphyry will explain and teach in this book are sourced from the disciples and followers of Aristotle. With this said, the study of the five predicables begins. I encourage you to read Porphyry yourself, both this chapter and the next. This is the end of the exposition of the content of Porphyry's Introduction, Chapter 1. To let you know, I will type out all of my lessons on Medium before I start posting any on YouTube. If you have any questions, concerns, or critiques, please type them down in the comments below. I'll do my best to respond. But before you leave, I'll give you key points to memorize this chapter. There's 7 points to memorize for this chapter. Point number 1. The five predicables are genus, species, difference, peculiarity, and accident. Peculiarity may also be used as property. The literal translation of the Greek word would just be property, but peculiarity seems to also be used interchangeably with property. So if you see property, it's peculiarity, and if you see peculiarity, it means property. So genus, species, difference, peculiarity, and accidents. But if you see property in there, that counts as peculiarity. Moving on. Point 2. The knowledge of the five predicables is necessary for understanding Aristotle's categories. In order for you to understand what Aristotle is saying, as he won't be teaching this explicitly, is to know these five predicables. And they're very simple. I mean, they're going to be used by Aristotle to organize his way of speaking of things. So just knowing genus and species and how things are organized in a logical manner, and how things are divided, and the type of properties and accidents you could say about these things, it'll just be helpful for you to understand what Aristotle is trying to say when he attaches certain qualities or relations to certain substances. Point number 3. The five predicables are essential tools for making definitions, divisions, and demonstrations. I also included a fourth D, but Porphyry doesn't use it in here, so just don't worry about this. The fourth D is descriptions, and I include the fourth D because when you'll get into accidents are attributes in which that can be present in things, and they're inherently present within things, and they can either be there or not be there. So, for example, accidents are ways in which that we define what kind of a thing something is. when we describe a person, we are going to use things such as color or height or the kind of clothes they're wearing or stuff like that. And these descriptions are not essential for the individual, as those things can be present and not be present. Now, of course, there's some nuance with this. So when we get into our study on accidents, there's going to be an exposition on what kind of things that are more stable as the language is used, that are more permanent or temporal. They can shift from one moment to another, or they just remain for most of our life but are still accidental. So just keep that in mind. There are 4 Ds and 5 predicables. So 5 predicables: genus, species, peculiarity, accident, and difference. Whereas for the 4 Ds, definitions, divisions, demonstrations, and descriptions. Point number 4. Porphyry promises to give us a brief summary treatment of these concepts. It's not supposed to be something systematic, even though that you could study this systematically. But Porphyry is trying to get into just the 5 predicables and explain what these 5 predicables are and demonstrate how these things are going to be used and the various definitions that they may have and the ways that they can be used. Point number 5. Porphyry avoids deep metaphysical questions of universals. Like I said, the 2 traditions that exist, of course there's going to be some other traditions, but the main 2 traditions, which is nominalism and realism, are, they will exist later on as answers to these questions, or at least supposed answers to these questions. Those sorts of answers and traditions Porphyry won't be covering, and I won't be covering. We'll only just be passing through these as of right now until further study later on down the line as we get into Aristotle. So if you're looking for that, I'm sorry, we won't be doing that. You can find other channels that'll teach this maybe, or I'll give you a link on what universals are. And point number 6. Porphyry will focus on the logical use of predicables rather than the metaphysical use of the predicables. So he's just going to be focusing on what will be later known as the Porphyrian tree model, which is just the logical classification model where you have at the very top the most general genera and at the very bottom the individuals. So I will include this image in the video. We will discuss more about that in the next video and the next chapter, chapter 2, which will be the longest chapter in Porphyry. So if you get confused and miss the terminology in chapter 2, don't worry. It is supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be very complicated because it's covering a lot of content. We'll go through chapter 2 slowly and hopefully we get through the entire thing. We're just going to be getting into the logical use of the predicables rather than what, like I said, the universals, which is the metaphysical discussions on the predicables. So lastly, point 7. The Peripatetics are the followers of Aristotle who developed and published his teachings. To explain why he does this, as people move away, as time moves on, people forget the teachers of the past. Nobody's really thinking about Parmenides or Socrates or Plato or any of their works. They're not going to be knowing what the critiques of Aristotle are, and he often speaks about these critiques in his books and as he's demonstrating his thoughts. And even when Aristotle speaks, when he's speaking about these predicables implicitly, nobody's going to have a clue as to what he's speaking about unless you have spent a majority of your time going back into those old traditions, going back into those old ideas and trying to bring them back so that you can understand the study. Porphyry just gets into the tradition itself and makes it super easy for us to understand what Aristotle meant about these things and what he's trying to say without us remaking the wheel, so to say. So their way of understanding Aristotle will be our source, and it will be Porphyry's source. So as we read through the Isagoge, we'll pretty much be getting ideas that are from Aristotle's students and from Aristotle himself. So the ways in which that the various definitions and the examples given for each of these predicables will be drawn from the Peripatetics. Now, I said that the Peripatetics won't be referred to, at least said by name, anymore by Porphyry, but throughout this entire lesson, from chapter 1 all the way to the last book, you're going to see him referring to these the ancients, and he's referring to the Peripatetics and what they thought about these things. He'll quote from them, he'll refer to them, but in expounding upon the school and stuff, he's not really interested in that. So he's concerned about what they had to say about these things, and that's what we're concerned about in this study. Just what are the 5 predicables understood by Aristotle. I'll make an effort on putting more videos on the following chapters sooner than my usual posting speed. These lessons are supposed to help you understand Porphyry's introduction, which in turn help you understand the categories. You can hop into Porphyry's Isagoge or Aristotle's categories on your own. But if you decide to continue along with me, I'll do my best to center our focus on our primary goal for studying classical reasoning, and that is to understand the contents of Aristotle's Organon. And with all that said, I hope that you have a blessed day, and I'll see you in the next video.